Hello and welcome to the third and final part of the analysis of iCAT7. iCAT7 was a challenger mock in our All India National Level CAT test series for CAT 18. A challenger mock is essentially a tough mock or a very tough mock that is designed not necessarily on the lines of the actual CAT. Of course, the pattern remains the same, but the questions are significantly tougher in each section so as to give you a feel of a mock where you might have tough sections all throughout the mock. So it's more a test of your preparedness than anything else. As we saw in the first two parts of the analysis, this mock was classified as tough with an average difficulty level per question greater than 2. So an LOD of 1 indicates easy and an LOD of 3 indicates tough. So this was above 2. You might feel that's just above moderate, but just to put things into perspective, the average LOD for CAT is somewhere between 1.9 to 1.95. So over 100 questions, if the average is going up by 0.1 points, then that is a significant amount. We saw earlier that the verbal ability section was extremely tough, whereas the DILR section was more or less at par with the actual CAT. We now draw our attention to the third section, that is quant, and we observe that the average LOD per question here is a little above 1.8. And that is why we have classified this section as a moderate to tough section instead of an easy section that we normally have in CAT. Now, why do we say this? Typically in CAT, the average LOD for quant is somewhere between 1.6 to 1.65. So if I look at these numbers, definitely this section was 10 to 15% more difficult than the actual CAT or any other normal mock that we would release. That is where the number of good attempts would really go down. Now, how do we generally define the number of good attempts, or how do we look at the quant section? Luckily for us, over the last 3 years, we've seen that the breakup of easy, moderate and tough questions in quant is more or less well defined. What do I mean by this? Roughly 15 to 17 questions in the quant section have been found to be easy. Now, it does not mean that this is a rule. Your mock can even have 25 easy questions. Your mock can have just 5 easy questions. So we cannot go and catch hold of the CAT authorities if the mock is different from this kind of a pattern. But typically we've seen 15 to 17 easy questions, 3 to 5 tough questions, and the rest of the questions can again be classified as moderate. Now, when we say that a question is moderate, the same question can be rated as tough by some faculty, easy by some other faculty, and moderate by some faculty. So moderate question is basically a gray area between easy and tough questions where the remaining questions can be classified. Now, in CAT, most faculty will say that you need to have more than 20 attempts or 22 attempts to try and have a good shot at clearing the sectional cutoff. If we look at this breakup, even if you do very well here, your overall attempts might be somewhere around 15. Assuming that you are unable to crack the tough questions, you are heavily dependent on this part of the mock to clear the cutoff. For this, it is extremely important that you diversify your risk and be good at as many chapters as possible. We've seen students who come to us and say that I'm good at arithmetic and algebra but bad at geometry. Now, what happens if your mock has a lot of moderate questions in geometry and modern math and you need these to clear the cutoff? What do you do in that case? So that is where if you increase your strength or increase your competence in as many chapters as possible, your chances of attempting at least half of these questions goes up dramatically. And that is where your chances of clearing the sectional cutoffs increase. Luckily for us, the quant section has 4 very discrete areas: arithmetic, algebra, geometry and modern math, where each chapter will fall into one of these 4 areas. So we can analyze each of these and arrive at typical strengths and weaknesses. Again, as we said, students come to us and say, I'm good at arithmetic. But that does not mean that a student is uniformly good at all chapters of arithmetic, or would be able to do arithmetic irrespective of what kind of LOD comes in. So for every mock, we need to go into greater detail into that area and see how that particular part of the section was structured and what would have been the optimal strategy to attempt each of these: arithmetic, algebra, geometry, modern math in the section. Let's do that for this mock. So again, this lists the difficulty level as we saw in the two earlier videos. If we see, as we said, the overall difficulty for the section was around 1.8. Clearly looking at these four sections, geometry was the most representative because it was nearly at par with the section, so it was the most balanced of the sections. Similarly, when I look at algebra, slightly tougher than the section. So obviously, if these two were more or less balancing each other out, there had to be one section which was significantly tougher and one which was significantly easier. We can see, and the good news for most students for this mock is that it was arithmetic, which most students are comfortable. That was the easiest, and it was significantly lower than the section average. On the other hand, modern math was really tough, tending more towards tough than even moderate. So if somebody was banking only on modern math, then that person would have been for a surprise. But had you been good at arithmetic and had you done a lot of questions here, potentially your chances of clearing the sectional cutoffs would have gone up. That is why, in spite of this number being high, 1.82, the number of good attempts is touching 20 rather than going towards 70. And we'll explain how we arrive at that number. So let's go into a little more detail into these four areas. Firstly, as you can see, the number of questions for each of these parts was 9 for arithmetic instead of the typical 11 or 12. So that increases the difficulty a bit because arithmetic typically has the easiest questions. Algebra, on the other hand, was 11. This number is generally, so these two numbers are generally interchanged. So obviously interchanging this ratio from 11:9 to 9:11 raises the difficulty. Geometry had more questions than usual at 10. Typically we've seen somewhere around 6, 7 or 8 questions. Luckily for us, geometry here was on the easier side, so that wasn't such a big problem. Modern math had the fewest questions. We've generally seen around 6 to 7 questions. Here we had just 4, but this compensated really by the number of tough questions. Going further into each area, we observe that among the 9 questions in arithmetic, 6 were either sitters or easy questions. Now what exactly is a sitter? Technically, in terms of LOD, a sitter and easy question is the same, that is LOD 1. But while solving in the exam, a sitter is something which can be done by just applying one formula or maybe just doing 2 steps or 3 steps and getting the answer. Whereas an easy question involves a little more application than a sitter. So it's a very thin line between the two. So here we can see that 2/3 of the arithmetic area was sitters. And then there were 2 moderate questions, but generally the moderate questions in arithmetic are simpler, and that's student feedback really. They are simpler than the moderate questions in geometry or modern math. So the chances of attempting these are also slightly higher. There was one tough question in arithmetic here, and let's assume for the time being that this could have been skipped. So even if I cover the rest of the stuff, I can say that my strategy for arithmetic would have to be maximize the easy questions and then try and select or then try and do the only moderate questions that we had. Now because there were only 2 moderate questions, here the selection is immaterial. Overall my strategy for arithmetic would have been maximization. When I compare this with algebra, which had 11 questions, I see that there are only 4 questions that are sitters or easy out of 11, which is definitely less than half, somewhere around, let's say 40% or so. Still, this has an average LOD just tending towards moderate. That is because 4 of the remaining questions are moderate. However, this is counterbalanced by the 3 tough questions. And tough questions in algebra typically tend to get unsolvable for students. So here the key part really is selecting the right questions to attempt. Out of these 11, the idea would be to try and maximize these 4 and within these go for the questions that you're comfortable with. So that would be very, very critical. Similarly, when I look at geometry, which is exactly nearly equal to algebra in difficulty, there is a very similar breakup. Out of the 10 questions, 4 are sitters or easy, so definitely these should have been tried. 2 are tough, so potentially you may not have been able to solve them, but these 4 moderate questions here were the ones that required a lot of selection and being careful about choosing them. So here again the key part would be selecting the right questions. Finally, when I look at modern math, I see hardly 4 questions, just 1 easy question, no sitter at all, and the rest were all tough. So here it was more a case of identifying this easy question. So if you see, there was just one section where you could have maximized your attempts. Everywhere else the game was about selecting the right question to attempt. And this is one key takeaway that you need to take from each CAT mock that you take. In quant, you can attempt 20 questions every single time. The key is to identify the right questions to try. Here if we were to look at attempts, let's break this down and say we have 9 sitters here and 6 easy questions. So if I look at this breakup, I observe that there are 15 easy questions, which is more or less on the lines that we just mentioned. So this part actually is as expected. On the other hand, when I look at the moderate questions, there are just 10 moderate questions. So this has gone down drastically compared to this number. And that has really contributed to the overall difficulty going up. Instead of the 3 to 5 tough questions, here I have 9 tough questions. So straight away this number has doubled or even tripled. Now when I look at this breakup, this is the area that is going to contribute to the lower attempts. But if I look at this area, the 15 easy questions, this will help me try and clear the sectional cutoff. If I consider these 15 and I select them wisely, it is very, very likely that I can attempt anywhere around 13 questions from these. Among the 10 moderate questions, if I have developed competence in a fair number of chapters, typically we've seen that the conversion ratio is that you are able to attempt anywhere between 50% to 2/3 of the moderate questions. Considering that it is a tough mock, I'll stop at 50% and say that somewhere around 5 attempts was possible. When I talk of attempts here, I'm talking about those questions where you are fairly sure that you got the right answer. Among the tough questions, let's not consider that we do not attempt any of these, because as CAT aspirants, we cannot have a situation where we don't touch tough questions at all. So even assuming a 20 to 25% conversion here, it was possible to do 1 or 2 tough questions here and there. So if I have this kind of a breakup, it was possible to touch 20 attempts, and this we believe would be fairly sufficient to clear the sectional cutoff. As we said, there were 9 sitters. So our faculty have come up with a list of these sitters here. You can have a look at this list. As we always say, this list is not exhaustive, which means you can add more questions to this list if you feel some other question, let's say 68 for example, is a sitter. You can always remove some questions and say 79 is not a sitter, it is moderate. So that is up to you. The key part here is that you need to make a list like this every time on your own, compare the two and look at these questions and check whether you attempted them. If yes, did you get the right or wrong answer? If you got the wrong answer, why did you go wrong? Where did you go wrong? If you did not attempt the question, was it because you did not see it, or was it because you did not understand it enough to attempt it? So these are the kind of questions that you need to ask yourself for each of these easy questions, and then sit with your mentor or faculty and understand where you could have changed your approach so that you identified these questions and attempted them. Finally, we look at this graph which we've shown you earlier for quant as well as for the 2 sections earlier. This essentially shows you the trend of difficulty for each question from 67 to 100. The blue lines indicate the MCQs, the pink orange lines indicate the numerical entries. So here, as you can see, there were fewer numerical entry questions. Now, Obviously, because this was a tougher mock, you can see a lot more questions going towards 3. Also, if I look at this chunk from 91 to 100, I can see there are definitely 7 to 8 tougher questions here. But even within these, when I split this mock, I can observe that there are smaller chunks of easy questions put together. I find at least 4 such chunks where there are 2 to 3 easy questions clustered together. Also, apart from these, so if I look at this first chunk of 5 questions, they are all easy to moderate, before which the first tough question starts. So this is something that you could have tried. Whereas when I look at this entire chunk, this is more tough to moderate with just one easy question. So here it becomes more like selection. Similarly, when I look at these 5, again no tough question, more of easy questions. So here again selection and maximizing your attempts. Whereas from this point onwards, if I start going to the end, there are more tough questions than easy. So then it becomes a matter of getting these easy questions right, or selecting them. So in each mock, you will find different such patterns emerging, and after the mock, you need to look at this and check your attempts and see whether you actually missed a chunk like this right at the end or somewhere in the middle, and because of that your attempts went down. So something like this might actually help you increase your attempts. Let's have a look at 1 or 2 questions. So for instance, when I look at, let's say, we look at question 77. A, B, C are roots of x cube minus 6x square plus 11x minus 6 equal to 0. What is the value of 4 minus A, 4 minus B, 4 minus C? Now there are 2 ways to solve this question. You do not necessarily need to find each of the roots. Now, one way to solve this question is, this has been given in the form 4 minus A, 4 minus B, 4 minus C, where ABC has the roots. Any cubic equation with roots ABC can be written as x minus A, x minus B, x minus C. If you compare these 2 equations, I can simply substitute x equal to 4, which means if I take x equal to 4 into this equation or this expression, I'll get the value of 4 minus A, 4 minus B, 4 minus C. So it's as simple as that. On the other hand, the other way to solve this question, if you do not think of this approach, if you open this bracket, you'll get a term which will be some constant, then you'll have an A plus B plus C, which is nothing but sum of roots. Then you will have another term which is in the form AB plus BC plus CA, which is sum of 2 roots taken at a time. And then you will have another term which is of the form ABC, which is product of the roots. Now in any such equation, each of these coefficients corresponds to one of these numbers. So if you know that expression, as we've told you in the earlier analysis as well, then just substitute these values, you get your answer. So one is a pure algebraic way for which you need to know certain properties. The other is a more commonsensical logical way where you need to realize that an equation can be written in 2-3 different ways. So you understand the right way to write this equation, compare it and solve it. So there are often multiple ways. You need to arrive at all of these or most of these and see what could have helped you better and which could have been applied. Let's look at a couple of other questions as well. For instance, when I look at 82, I need to find the area of triangle, basically the ratio of area of these 2 shaded parts. So here you need to remember that a hexagon is nothing but a collection of 6 equilateral triangles, and area of a triangle is half into base into height. So everywhere if you start applying that property, you will be able to solve this question much faster. Okay, I wanted to show you 85. There is this question which says 110 passengers are traveling in a bus. At a certain stop, 10% of the girls and 15% of the boys get down, while 13 passengers board the bus. if there are 109 passengers in the bus now, what was the initial ratio of girls to boys? So this can be very easily done using linear equations. X plus y equal to 110. Now if 10% girls go down, so 0.9x plus 0.85 boys or 0.85y plus 13 equal to 109, solve the equations, etc. But when I look at what is asked, what was the initial ratio of girls to boys? So if I say that it was x is to y, then x plus y essentially should correspond to 110. Now when I look at these ratios, since these are people, girls and boys, this total of 5 and 6 should divide this completely. Then I will get an integral value here. So when I look at these totals 11, 5, 13 and 3, I observe that only these two numbers can integrally or completely divide 110. So these two just cannot be my answer. Now having done that, I can orally find that okay, if this is 11, this is 55 and 66. Similarly, if this is 2:3 and so the common ratio is 22, then this is 44 and 66. Now the question says 10% of the girls go off. If there are 55 girls and 10%, this should be 50 and 60, my bad. So if 10% girls go off, then 5 girls go off, integral number. Whereas if out of 44, 10% girls go off, 4.4 girls go off. Now that is not possible. So again, this is eliminated. This is my right answer. So sometimes using this presence of mind also helps. But that is if you realize what is to be asked and you fit in the right things at the right place. So yes, certain questions can be done using properties, which you need to know. Certain questions can be done using logic and common sense, which you need to apply. But with the right selection, you can definitely touch 20 attempts as required in this section and clear the cutoff. On the whole, if we were to classify this mock, as we said, it was a challenger with an extremely tough verbal section, a standard DILR section and a moderate to tough quant section. So the number of good attempts would be somewhere around 13 for verbal, 16 for DILR and 20 for quant. Overall, anything above 45, so anywhere around 47, 48 good attempts would be a reasonably good performance to clear the sectional cutoff. This completes the analysis for iCAT07. We'll soon come up with the analysis for the remaining 6 mocks. The analysis for all the previous mocks are already up on our official YouTube channel, which is given in this link here. You can subscribe to our channel by clicking on this link. You can also receive notifications every time a new video is put up by hitting the bell button. Please feel free to put in your comments, feedback or questions on the thread below the video. Keep watching. Thank you and wish you all the very best.